from the start, we saw strong traction. So we have more than 1,000 enterprise customers. We have more than 6 million recurring revenue already. And that's how this concept of Impossible Cloud Network was born, where we essentially want to decentralize the cloud, not only an alternative, but I would say actively challenge what's already out there and provide the natural evolution to this. If you have the majority of the global economy in the hands of a few providers, that's not a good idea, period.
Hello and welcome, and we're here at Holistic Investments, and I'm delighted to have an incredible guest today, Sebastian Pfeiffer, who's a co-founder and managing director of Impossible Cloud Network. Hi, Sebastian.
Yeah, hi there. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Traditionally, we will start with digging to a deeper level, what is Impossible Cloud Network and what is Seb's journey in this space like. But before that, a disclaimer that this content is for informational purposes only. You should not construe any such information as material and legal, tax, investment, financial, or any other advice. So they cannot be cut off from the interview, and we go straight to understanding what is the origin of the thought process behind it. So let's start with the origin story. Who are you and what was the problem where you're trying to solve when you founded Impossible Cloud Network?
Yeah, so I'll take this back to my study days, actually. So I have a business background, and during my studies, a colleague pitched this concept of the technology blockchain, right? And it intrigued me initially, but I kind of put that aside. Fast forward a couple of years later, during my master degree, this came up again, not so much focusing on technology, but more on the hype aspect around it. This was during, this kind of peak aspect, 1920, right? And again, it was the second data point that intrigued me a lot, but I put that aside. And then after my degree, I went to management consulting. So like one of the MBB firms. And here I was fortunate enough to learn like a broad toolkit, I would say, a lot of functions, a lot of topics that I was privileged enough to see. And then after a good amount of 3 years of having this experience, I was actually hired by Possible Cloud back in the days, right? Where it kind of clicked to me because these two concepts came together. One is this beautiful, amazing technology aspect, and then the toolkit I already had that I was now able to deploy, right? So that's kind of the story, how I came into this whole field. More specifically for Possible Cloud Network, one of our co-founders, Kai, he bootstrapped a gaming startup to more than 1,400 employees very successfully. And then after his NASDAQ IPO, you can imagine gaming is very cloud heavy, I would say, right? And he looked at this landscape and identified that there's not really a lot of alternatives, right? So there's really only big tech out there. And he's had this pain point and was trying to solve it. And that's how this concept of Impossible Cloud Network was born, where we essentially want to decentralize the cloud and offer an alternative, not only an alternative, but I would say actively challenge what's already out there and provide the natural evolution to this.
And yeah, so I think it's important for people to also understand like what is actually a decentralized cloud and how is it different, how ICN is differentiated from traditional cloud players like AWS or Google Cloud or others.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I would actually start by kind of explaining what the cloud actually means.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's kind of this vague concept. Everybody has heard it, but nobody really knows. So, at the end of the day, in simple terms, you rent someone else's computer, right? So, for instance, or hardware, I should say. So, for instance, if you put your photos in iCloud or whatever phone you have, you essentially leverage Apple's or the partner's hardware. You rent the capacity from them, right? What cloud is that at an industrial scale. And I should add, it's very successful, right? So it's more than 300 billion annual turnover and growing 30% annually, right? The main cloud competitors out there is AWS, Google, Microsoft, right? That's mostly US based. There's a bit of Asia presence by Alibaba, and then there's like a long tail of small providers. I think where this successful model is showing starting to show cracks in the facade is with this new how do I put this digital sovereignty movement coming up, right? So you have these political factors mostly that drive local or a more active thinking around digital sovereignty, right? So that's, I think, one of the main points that's where these cracks in the facade are showing. Because if, at the end of the day, if you leverage big tech providers, you're exposed to this ecosystem that's not always where you are, right? Then second, where we see cracks in the facade is the vendor lock-in. That's what we call essentially once you're used to this ecosystem, it locks you in because you leverage all the services. And to be fair, they're quite good at this, right? So how it usually happens is you get credits, you leverage these credits, and then overnight, basically your credits are used up, and then you're locked up in the ecosystem, right? So all of these points is where decentralized cloud can come in. It's a decentralized network rather than a centrally owned network. It's fully open and it's fully permissionless, right? So everybody can leverage it and everybody can contribute to it, and it's not owned by this single entity. So maybe politics aside, my final sentence on this or aspect on this would be, again, politics aside, if you have the majority of the global economy in the hands of a few providers, that's not a good idea, period. If you believe, again, US aside, it's just not a good idea, I think, and we are here to change that.
Yeah, and that's I think is a very important point, right? So right now we see the cracks in the facade for the geopolitical situation with wars, right? And I assume, let's say, at some point Chinese, founders or like, especially those who are located, in the mainland China, they, for whatever reason, they would not be able to use, American cloud computing, like, networks, right? So therefore, potentially, like, they would love some more decentralized version of it. Is this correct to assume that because of this, like, rivals and, like, challenges that we see in traditional geopolitics, that it will also impact the choice of companies across the world?
Yeah, we actually see this right now. So we already have one of the first services active in the ecosystems, in our ecosystem, which is an S3 object storage, right? So I'm not going to go into technical details here, but at the end of the day, it's a storage solution. The first one, after the launch, we will hopefully have a much bigger ecosystem with more services. But anyway, we already see this inbound demand based on exactly what you say, right? So you have these companies that look for alternatives other than these big tech providers. However, I should nuance this that it's not the only factor that drives them, right? So if you think about Web3 projects in general, again, technology is amazing. There's a lot of smart people. What you have to acknowledge is the customer, in our case, the business, is not putting a decentralized solution as their first priority, right? So you have to, as a first priority, you have to offer what they already have. You have to make the migration seamless, and you have to offer a service that's at least compatible to what they currently have, right? So they won't make any sacrifices. But again, if you build a service that can match what they now have, plus a decentralized benefit to this, that's where you find that's where you can open the door to this massive opportunity.
And yeah, I think it's a very important point. And what I wanted to pick your brain also, like in terms of the deeper dive of like how, like ICN, is often referred as the first multi-service DePIN, right? So I think it's good to digest it because people don't really understand DePINs, and then you're talking about the multi-service DePIN. So let's go one by one. What does it actually mean, and why is it significant?
Right. So maybe let's start establishing what DePIN actually means, right? It's a decentralized physical infrastructure. And for us, how we see the market is that there's a lot of projects out there that focus on a single use case. And I'm not sure if this proverb or also exists in English, like most rivers run into the sea, like essentially there's different approaches to anything. But we believe that if you have a holistic ecosystem and you build it in an open way, so for us, the cloud ecosystem that not only has CPU compute, GPU compute, but actually has a broad hardware network that can be leveraged for all these services, that's where we see the holy grail. So it needs to be multi-service offering. Again, coming back to that aspect, right? So if a customer looks at alternatives, and he finds, okay, there's this specific service that I'm looking for, perfect. There's a much higher likelihood that they say, okay, I want to switch my cloud ecosystem, right? And that's again where the holy grail comes in. If you can offer them the holistic package that they're already using, that's where how we position our multi-service ecosystem, right? So again, offering any type of hardware fully accessible for them, scaling according to any use case. That's how we position ourselves.
Yeah, and that's amazing because I've also was reading that you claim to deliver the enterprise grade performance because a lot of people might think, well, okay, great. Well, we are happy with our AWS or like, Google Cloud or Azure, like, why should we even switch? So can you share real use cases or examples where you're replaced traditional cloud infrastructure?
That's basically driving our thought process from the start. We said, okay, instead of having technology and trying to put a product on top of it, we flip the script, right? We say, okay, let's solve a real problem and then scale the technology accordingly. And we started with one first service in the ecosystem, which is again this the storage S3 object storage solution. And from the start, we saw strong traction, right? So we have more than 1,000 enterprise customers. We have more than 6 million recurring revenue already. So what makes it different is that we can solve or we can match already existing performance requirements from customers, right? And by the way, compliance is actually one of them that few projects focus on, right? So we have performance compliance, all that. Why? Because again, this is what customers are asking for, right? So this basically this concept we now scale with an enterprise grade network. Why enterprise grade? It's only very selected sources of hardware, right? So what do we mean by selected sources? Not in the sense that everybody can contribute, everybody can, but in the sense of it needs to be according to what the customer is asking for. So for instance, running out of a data center. Again, there's different approaches to everything. We believe that the business customer out there wouldn't necessarily like to leverage the average, I don't know, computer or laptop hardware, right? What they want is co-location from a data center. So only then, if you match the current performance that they're used to, plus put this decentralized element on top, that's where you can actually beat them. And again, coming back to the fact that, I think it's an open secret that Web3 mostly runs on Web2 traditional cloud. Yeah. So if you for instance take Ethereum, a lot of validators, like there's a lot of aspects I think that Web3 still leverages from Web2, and we are here to change that. But why? I would ask the question, why hasn't this changed already if you have a couple of providers out there already? Why? Again, because the performance is simply not good enough. You
Yeah.
have to have this enterprise grade aspect to it, and then you can offer them a true seamless migration.
And you're correct here. Like, so I think you're touching a very interesting point, right? Because it is ironic that like we're talking about decentralized values and like, the revolution of decentralization and all. Most of the cloud compute is very much centralized, which actually technically jeopardizes not only on the level of values, but also on a level of like, performance. Because like if we'll be turned off, the validators like, will collapse. So by the way, how do you see this? Do you have statistic of how much like of dApps are actually on traditional servers versus decentralized?
I don't, but that's actually a very, very fair question. Maybe we should come up with that statistic. But I think like generally the concept of like this single point of failure, you can see that almost any day now, right? So again, coming into that's where we see inbound demand in the ecosystem, because that every single time a service is down, people ask, okay, is there any alternatives to this? So like I
Yeah.
think Slack is always a good example because Slack every once in a while it's down. You ask yourself, okay, why? Oh, there was this whatever outage, right? Same with other services, and this is again where decentralized systems can come in and improve things.
Yeah. I was reading one of the reports that I don't know how credible it is to be frank, like that 48% of like of the surveyed dApps are like they rely on centralized backend. So we're talking about roughly half, which is
Yeah.
still very sad in my opinion, right? Out of all the like thousands of dApps, like, it's yeah. So your bet is essentially to kind of minimize this number, right?
Yes, I would say that's definitely one of the key aspects. But I would also say that there's also this Web2 opportunity out there, right? The regular business, the bakery on around the corner, whatever this mid-sized entity that runs on cloud. Like there's cloud is everywhere, really is, and it's driven by big tech. If you look in Web2, Web3, right, and we are here to finally truly challenge that.
Okay, so we talked about how you're different from traditional providers, right? And then like or hybrid alternatives, right? May I also like, challenge you a little bit, like, for people who are again not familiar with like what you're building, like how you're like we know like Filecoin, which is a huge, IPFS, like, like decentralized storage network. We know storage, like Spheron, Kive, Terminal 3. So maybe you can help us to understand how you're also close to DePIN, like, competitors and others. Like, where do you see yourself in this entire axis of like, differentiator?
Yeah, that's a fair question. There's a few aspects actually. It kind of depends on the specific project. So I would start by the general idea of what you're aiming for as a project. So
Hmm.
again, what we aim for is a multi-service ecosystem. Yeah. So what we see is that it's not only one specific use case, but it's multiple use cases that you need to cover, right? I think that's the first differentiating criteria. And second is it kind of depends on the hardware that you're using. So there's different approach to things. I'm not saying that this is better than that. What we believe in is that a customer at the end of the day cares that it's a high performance, so it needs to be out of a data center. There's other projects that, for instance, leverage consumer hardware. So
Hmm.
that's the second one. And then third, as a project from an architectural perspective, how we built it is we, at the end of the day, provide a fully programmable, permissionless, open network that you can use. It's essentially a level playing field, if you will, which then any cloud service provider can use to deploy their service on. So
Hmm.
what we offer is from a hardware perspective, a level playing field, meaning you don't need to leverage your own hardware out of data centers for a lot of money. Mostly, you don't need to leverage Web2 providers. You can leverage us, right? That's the whole idea. And I think these three things combined make us very unique. And again, the initial success shows it, right? So we already have these hundreds, if not thousands, of enterprises using our services. We
Yeah.
have multi-million recurring revenue already. And I think this is a starting point only. And once we scale, I think yeah, you're going to see this established over time.
Yeah, the fact that you're already like a profitable business, I want to emphasize that's rare in crypto. So that like so it already showcases that you're building it properly like a traditional company in terms of operations, but with decentralized values, right? So that's already, I think, very, very fair point that, you're already
No
stepping.
financial advice, like you said in the beginning, right?
Yes, yes. But no, I want to emphasize because I know like we are also investors and like, we watch a lot of projects and there's very few companies that generate multi-million recurring revenue. Like it just statistics. So especially young companies like yours, right? So that's already a good achievement. Which brings me to the next topic. Like one of the, I would say, incentivization models that you chose is to eventually issue your token, ICNT, right? So let's dive into ICNT token mechanics and like, what role does it play in the ecosystem and what's the token utility beyond the staking and governance, right? So let's start with this.
Yeah, so we have is three elements essentially of, or four, I should say, of the ICNT. So first of all, from an architectural perspective, again, you have hardware that's being contributed to the ecosystem, right? So that's where the ICNT comes in. The hardware provider running usually out of a data center contributes their hardware. And in exchange, if they abide by certain KPIs, they get rewarded in ICNT, right? The second is the service provider ecosystem. So again, what we do is we put an abstraction layer, create this level playing field, which then projects can leverage to deploy their services. First service is that storage service that I mentioned. And they essentially pay a service access fee to leverage this evolutionary cloud network, right? So that's the second aspect. And the third aspect is you have hyper nodes that essentially check on a continuous basis the performance of both the service and the hardware, right? So essentially, these ensure the system's integrity. And this is for the average Joe, right? Technically, anybody could deploy this hypernode.
Mhm.
So, and they get rewarded for their service in ICNT as well. So you have these three aspects where the ICNT comes in. And then lastly, you have, as you mentioned, like for instance, a staking mechanism that also contributes to this ecosystem where ICNT is used.
Yeah, and in terms of like the current success, I mean, I think it's public information that you sold like 29,000 hypernodes and raised more than $31 million, which is also impressive. But what makes this launch different? Like what is next?
What makes the laws different? I think that what
Can
we've done
I
with
can
this,
elaborate on this because you see the previous one, if we go to more of a critical moment, like we've seen examples of when people sell a lot of nodes. On one hand, it can be an incredible success. On the other hand, it can dilute the supply, right? So how do you balance out, the selling of nodes and then token offering, like, to make sure that there's going to be not too much tokens available?
a fair question, yeah. And I see this actually, I tend to agree with you that a lot of projects do exactly that, right? So you have that initial push and then it changes over time. What we have in place is a couple of elements where this, I would say, how we moderated this behavior, right? So number one is we limited the amount of fair drops in the beginning and we created long lockups for investors, right? So we have a sensible float amount, I should say. The second aspect is you have, or we aimed for very good partners to launch with. I can't get into details yet, but I believe that we, from the start, have a very good start of the ecosystem already. And then third one on the tokenomics, to be very specific, what we built is a, I would almost say an over time in itself self-perpetuating cleaning mechanism of the hardware that's being used. So you can imagine that if a hardware provider onboards into the ecosystem, right, they get a static fee. Yeah? So a kind of reward to say, thank you for the hardware. This we're using it now. But more importantly, there's a second aspect, which is dynamic utilization. So the more the hardware of this hardware provider is being used, the more rewards they will get. So over time, it incentivizes only the best performing hardware in the ecosystem, right? And again, you can only enable this with real world demand because how would you otherwise depend on this dynamic or not depend, but leverage this dynamic reward, right? If it's not real world demand. So there's real world demand that's picking on or leveraging the best performing hardware. And only this then over time enables this flourishing ecosystem, right? So these three things combined, I think, make it a very sensible approach to a float. Again, no financial advice, right?
Of course. No, I think it's important so that people hear it from you as, co-founder. And then I think another aspect which is equally important to understand is how does ICNTN like capture the value from real world usage, right? Especially considering that an ARR and node-based reward sharing.
Yeah, so the I would say that let me take a step back, right? How cloud works, how is the reward demand, as you put it, right? How is it being captured generally in the cloud industry, right? And that's important to understand. I realize it's kind of boring for most people because it's not exciting, but it's important to understand. It's not a direct relationship from the provider to the customer. Usually you have this independent or intermediary layer, right? So it's distributors, resellers, not going to go into detail, but at the end of the day, you have this intermediary layer. And what you need to achieve is a foot in the door in this intermediary layer. And I keep coming back to this. This is how we started and how we're scaling now. Once you have achieved that foot in the door and that intermediary layer, that's when you get access to this broad cloud reward usage. Yeah. So it's essentially that starting point that enables all of this. And then the second aspect you ask, okay, how do you now put this into the protocol, right? How do you have everybody participate in this? So the provider that captures this intermediary layer buys with a network access fee based on ICNT, right? They buy their access into the network. And that's basically these two elements combined enable all of this. So basically we capture this, we're bringing this on-chain, this cloud, big cloud market on-chain with this direct mechanism. And again, there's different ways to contribute here. You can become your own provider, right? You can leverage some of these aspects. You can run a hypernode by essentially establishing or ensuring the network's integrity, or you can contribute hardware and then advertise this hardware as being part of this layer.
Got it. And then in terms of like, how do you ensure and measure so like, the place of where this token stability? So you mentioned like the longer lockups, right? Healthy post-market launch, like any other like I would say tools or techniques that you were consulting maybe your market makers or some other partners who will help you to kind of make sure that the project will sustain itself? Because this is one of the biggest fears of early adopters, right? How to make sure that, the project token is like still there and like gradually building these charts and not doing like, big, sweeps.
I agree. And I think that's one of the things that sets us apart. Again, we have taken a rather different approach to most projects out there. We said, let's build the foundation. And then once we've built it, we can scale accordingly. So what we've done is we've solved one of the first use cases, one of the use cases that can bring real world demand. And now after the launch, we're going to scale that and expand on that. Yeah, I think that's very crucial to understand because as you said, most Web3 projects out there start with great ideas, great concept, pitch these concepts, basically raise on these concepts, and then after the launch, start to deliver. We've actually have been delivering for a good amount of time already before the launch. Yeah. So I think this is just the foundation. I mean, that's one of the visionary pieces that drew me into this company is you have this amazing opportunity. Now we have the first POC, if you will, POC in the sense of we've shown that it does work, that Web2 customers are willing to, not willing, maybe let me rephrase that, are actually ecstatic to use our services, right? We're not paying them to use us. They're paying us, right, to deliver services to them, right? And this is just the first part of it. After the launch, this is going to expand and have many, many more services. So that's going to at least gets me up in the morning because I believe this is not only potential, but we've already delivered on the first aspect of that.
Yeah, and I think it's already like incredibly important, like, that you have this proof of concept and people can test it, right? And that's, you have clients who are like very, like keen on using your product, right? I do agree. That's like already a huge success. Now, in terms of, by the way, I want to touch a few other legal points, right? Because this is a lot of like biggest concerns. Since you're German, so I'm sure you're very, very meticulous in regulatory compliance narratives, right? And many Web3 infra projects, hit the regulatory roadblocks. So in your case, how has your Swiss/EU first compliance approach given you a strategic edge?
It's a very good question. I'm not sure if it's a strategic, maybe a strategic edge is actually the right phrasing. Maybe for the listeners to understand, right? So we're based in Switzerland, so we are technically under FINMA regulation, right? Not technically, practically. And I would say this has ups and downs. Yeah, the upside is that you have clarity. Yeah, so there's a lot of projects that launch here for a good amount of time already. The ecosystem actually, I think, is great. There's a lot of names in the industry, big names that have launched and are still here in Switzerland. That's one. And then two, that clarity brings alongside a very clear regulatory framework. So that framework coming to the downside, I would say, is very strict. Strict in a sense, you need to be aware of a lot of things. With that clarity in mind, you can abide by that clarity, but it's kind of almost a disadvantage, I would say, to other projects that don't have this strict regulatory framework. Just an example, we have to be careful in putting emojis in tweets because it could promise future token gains. So this type of language you have to be careful of. Other projects don't, right? But with that, as you put it, it's a strategic advantage because over time, I think the hype aspect is going to die down. What is going to remain in this industry is projects that have the right foundation and are not only built on hype, right? And I think what this regulatory framework it actually kind of forces us, in at least from a regulatory perspective, right? It forces us to remain in this foundation mode. And maybe a last aspect on this, it also allows you to almost very easily comply with other regulation, right? So let's say you are built on the, not going to name names, other regulatory environments, and then you come into Switzerland, you come into MiCAR, then you obviously, if you offer your token there, you need to comply with that regulation, right? But if you're based in Switzerland, it makes it much easier because it's such a very clear but also strict structure, right? So that makes it almost easier to comply with other regulation.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think it's, people respect Switzerland as one of the most, I would say, safest, like, and one of the most clear frameworks, like in the world. They are known, like I had in my, by the way, in my show, like people who were the first, like DAO foundations, like, the Ethereum, as we know, was there, right? So
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
yeah, so that's I think is a very smart approach. And then maybe a few words about what markets are you looking to expand on? Like, maybe you are looking to get more licenses or like, just what is your expansion strategy?
So I think there's two aspects to this. One is the business building aspect, and one is the token aspect, right? With regards to the token, of course, there's a global audience, so we want to make it accessible for everybody. Again, I can't share details yet. On the business building side, we have found an edge in the, I would say, the Western Hemisphere, right? This is where we initiated and are now scaling our business traction. I think as a next stepping stone is going to be the rest of the world, right? Mainly Asia driven, but it works a bit differently on the cloud over there. I do want to maybe raise one other aspect that you said with regards to token. Singapore, funnily enough, were once regarded as one of those, I would say, they gave more leeway in terms of regulatory frameworks. And they are starting to crack down now, right? So I've seen some, like, a transitionary period with a more strict framework, and some projects actually received a cease and desist order, right? So
Yeah.
that's one of the aspects that we always had in mind is if you go for this clarity and abide by the strict regulation, it's going to be easy over time. And I think we're just going to see more of that.
100%. Yeah, I've seen those too. So I was glad that you mentioned that because, yeah, people love this. I think it's truly your competitive advantage. Now, in terms of other like things that people probably did not notice or did not follow, like, in details, like you partner with major players like Supermicro, like an IoTeX, iTheer, and many others. What's the broader strategic vision, like, here in terms of AI or GPU compute, DePIN synergies, like maybe some other big announcement that you're preparing?
Yeah, so I think that the big vision I'm portraying here, you can't do this on our own, right? That's where you need these partners, and that's, I think, mutually beneficial a relationship for everybody involved, right? At the end of the day, we want to have a composable architecture. So what do I mean by composable? The Again, coming back to what differentiates us, we want to make this in an open way, meaning you can take in a Lego brick type of format, you can take aspects of different pieces of this architecture and combine them individually. And this is where some of these partners can come in, right? Supermicro on the hardware side, but also IoTeX or Aether. At the end of the day, all of us, I believe, in the Web3 universe, I would always call it, have a joint understanding of challenging and changing the current environment out there. And what we say is, why not do it together, right? Why not have different parties contributing to this rather than everybody kind of seeking their own solution.
Hmm.
And that's where we see an ecosystem. I mean, I keep coming back to this, an ecosystem of services rather than one project or entity building all of this themselves. Maybe let me provide an anecdote from the Web2 side. Again, coming back to the boring cloud aspect. What I meant in the intermediary layer is not only the sales part, but also the integrations part. So S3 object storage is mostly used as a backend part to an already existing software solution, like for instance, a Veeam or a Acronis. And what you need to do is you need to integrate into that software, and then that bundle is what attracts users, right? So I think that principle is also something we can use on the Web3 side. Maybe there is ways to bundle rather than everybody doing their own thing and provide a better value to the end customer.
Yeah, I think that is also very, very interesting point, right? And you also mentioned in some of your previous interviews, I was listening to that about the important aspect of composability. Like, how easy is it for devs or businesses to build an ICN and what incentives are in place?
So we envision this to be very much open and without gatekeepers. So anybody can technically build on us, deploy and earn, right? Earn in the sense of the both from a reward perspective, right? From the user, meaning sales, but also leverage the ecosystem that's already there. I mentioned this before, composability in the sense of Lego bricks, right? You can mix, match, and scale on demand.
Yeah.
coming back to this open secret that Web3 is built on traditional cloud, this credit hopping, right? I mentioned this before. Any startup can get a specific credit from a big tech company. Maybe they hop to the next one. That's where the credit hopping comes in. And at some point you're so intertwined, you lack the perspective to leave, right? What
Mhm.
can make you leave, or what is a dedicated, a mix of a service that's currently not offered. And what we want to offer is an ecosystem where you don't have to leave, right? It's no single entity in charge, meaning it's owned by everybody. And if you have that one service that's somewhere else, you can basically, with this composability deployed in this ecosystem, which makes it much more attractive. It's like you can almost imagine it like a self-perpetuating ecosystem over time. Yeah.
Yeah.
So instead of having this siloed big tech provider, you have this open ecosystem that's permissionless, where everybody can deploy and leverage fantastic cloud services.
Yeah, I think it's also a great point. Like credit hopping, like, it's a big thing, to be honest. Like in my previous startups, I did it. So I'm one of the examples. Like,
I mean,
and
it's logical, you know, it makes sense.
of
Yeah.
course. And people don't realize it's sometimes about like just capital efficiency. It's not always like when you're a young startup, it's not always about features, it's also about like incentives. So I think you thought it through well enough, like, to incentivize people, and that's already important. In terms of your community, so that's what I want to touch upon because again, we're talking about the values of decentralization. Community is always a priority. What is your strategy in terms of like, working with community influencers, other marketing partners, like, for, it's hard to market deep tech infra focused projects. So maybe some of the tricks that you already see and apply.
Yeah, I mean, amen to that, right? It's, I think first of all, community is almost everything that we do is community oriented. Yeah, it's not only. I mean, it starts from the average Joe that kind of sees this project and becomes enthusiastic. It goes across to developers, yeah, that want to interact with the ecosystem, that might want to contribute, that might want to deploy a cloud service. Who knows? And then you have advocates in general. All of this to me is a community framework, and all of this needs different elements to drive this forward. I would see this as a mutually beneficial process that's pushing this entire project forward. It's almost like a movement, if you will, right? So at the end of the day, you need to create this momentum that drives this project forward. Again, coming back to where we came from, it's good that we have this proof point, and now we need the community and other projects, other partners to build on that and create this self-perpetuating ecosystem. To me, community, it's more than just, a Discord ping, hey guys. To me, community is, it has so many different facades that, as you put it, of course also needs rewards at the end of the day, right? So what we're saying is we create this open ecosystem for everybody to contribute. And if you contribute, you will be rewarded because you're contributing to this demand driven, real world driven project.
And you already have already like a vibrant existing community, right? So I'm curious, what would be your message to early contributors and community node operators, like people who are like looking to buy ICNT token today?
First thing I would say is I am very much appreciative of everybody that's joining this project. If you came in early or just now, thank you for believing in us. And I would say that we are just at the starting point, right? So again, we're not here to have short-term hype success. We're here to finally challenge Web2 traditional cloud, not only in a siloed way, not only a single use case, but challenge the entire thing. And that's what everybody that joins this movement is in for. So again, thank you for everybody for joining. Thank you for being early in this entire evolutionary process.
Beautiful. And what should the community be watching for, like, for the next 60 days, like around mainnet staking, token rewards? Maybe you already mentioned some of them, but maybe a few other things that we missed.
Sure. So I would start, of course, short term with the mainnet launch, mainnet alongside that staking, as you mentioned, exchange listings. But I would focus beyond that on the long term aspect of the ecosystem expansion, right? So 60 days might sound like a lot now, right? It's 2 months, but what happens in 60 months, right? 4 to 5 years. That's where I think the value in this project and this movement lies in this ecosystem, right? So that's mainly what I think is enticing. So the not only the short but the mid to long term future
And do you have a date already for mainnet?
soon.
I know. It's a tricky question. I know you cannot say it was a test. But okay, so we are talking about let's talk about a little bit the future, right? Like and how do you foresee it's like what's your long-term vision? How do you see the cloud landscape evolving in the coming 5 to 10 years, and what role will ICN play then?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. The change we've seen in the last, I would say, year or so, if that trend continues to be so, we're going to see a lot more regional focus, right? So instead of having these big tech providers from America or Asia, we're going to see a lot more regional focus. If it's us or another project, right? Alongside that, it offers a great opportunity. I mentioned this already. What we already see is a tailwind for what we offer. I think that decentralized cloud offers a not a but the best solution to all of this because it's not these regional smaller providers, but it's a global digitally sovereign movement that allows for all these preferences to be fulfilled. So if you look at AI, for instance, right? There AI, even if you disregard the regional aspect, the digital sovereign aspect, AI needs one thing, and that's edge performance. Yeah. Even just that aspect hints at the fact that you need much more decentral locations, decentral meaning closer to you. The US has 30-ish data centers around the world, which doesn't sound like that much, right? And especially if you need edge performance, meaning performance close to you, that's where decentralized hubs can come in because we are set up in a way, our architecture is designed in a way that we can potentially leverage hundreds of nodes rather than just 30. So these two major trends, digital sovereignty and need for edge performance, putting a is providing a grand opportunity for a unified decentralized cloud layer, which again is something we are believing in and what we're delivering on.
That's a very, very interesting outlook. And for the crypto native investors, like, and Web2 tech VCs alike, why should they not miss this opportunity? Why do you think that out of all the noise that we have with AI, like gaming, like, a lot of other things happening across, like, why do you think that cloud compute is the future?
I think that first of all, again, no financial advice. Other than that, I think timing is almost everything when it comes to ideas becoming reality. There's, I think, countless aspects or examples in the past where the idea is only now being delivered because they were too early. Also, vice versa, right? It was delivered, or the timing was great, and then they passed that and only delivered too late. I think timing here is perfect. It could not be better. Again, we have this self-perpetuating currently mechanism of this digital sovereignty. We have AI coming along, and we have, I would say, delivered on this already. And the confluence of these factors coming together makes this project very interesting. And again, keeps me up at night because I believe that the opportunity is there and the timing is crucial. The timing is there, and it's perfect. I almost want to say a third aspect, but I would put that kind of in brackets, which is we see a bit of a skepticism on the altcoin market with only, I would say, the blue chips being pushed, right? I would almost call this again an advantage for us because we have that foundation. We don't rely on the hype, but we rely on real world demand, right? So I would almost see that as a positive outlook in that sense, coming into this confluence of factor of timing.
So do you also believe that with advance of AI, like, again, obviously we see there's a huge demand of compute power. Like, there was estimated that like I don't remember the exact number, but US should build like 8 new like nuclear power plants to be able to cater like the needs in the coming 3 years. And God knows what's gonna happen in the 5, 10 years. So with ICN, do you see that can also minimize the costs and improve the existing facilities?
So two aspects I would raise here. First one is the example of AWS. So AWS spends, I think, 100 billion this year on their infrastructure, right? 100 billion. It's just a tremendous amount, I think. And obviously nobody can compete with this. Yeah, there's no way unless you use the superpower of Web3, right? Which is the bootstrap way and not just simply deploying capital. And then two, US also said that they will not be able to cater to their demand, inbound demand, despite this huge investment on a yearly basis. So if you let that sink in, I think again, at the very least, you're gonna have spillover. But even in a better sense, you can build on this momentum, right? So that's the first aspect. And then two, I would say what decentralized cloud allows you to do is leverage inefficiencies in the system. So you can almost compare it to like a hotel slash Airbnb type of thing. Yeah? It, it's a coexistence now. I mean, let's see where this goes, also with regulatory aspect. But my point is that what Airbnb was able to do is leverage inefficiencies in the market by providing this ecosystem. Yeah, and that's similar. I would say similar thing what we are trying to do, right? We don't want 30 hubs around the world. We want hundreds or even more hubs around the world. Maybe not hubs, but smaller nodes, which can leverage inefficiencies in the electricity grid, in a lot of things, right? And this can improve, I would say, several aspects of the infrastructure out there.
Are you ready for a hardcore question? If AWS would offer you $1 billion right now, would you sell your company?
I would flip this actually. I would say thank you for being interested, first of all. Yeah, it's good that we are on your radar. It seems like we're doing things right. But then I would say, why don't you start leveraging us? So the ability of us to scale a enterprise grade network basically overnight with edge performance, with all these criteria, then a collaboration, I think, is much more useful, given that they embrace the more of a decentralized ethos, I should say.
Amazing. No, that's actually an incredible answer. Like, and then the beauty of it, we didn't rehearse it, like, so it comes from your heart. So, because that is the final test of your commitment to the values, right? To the core mission of the project. Like, what should people expect? Like, whenever, sometimes founders get success and then they just like, forget about the core mission. In your case, the answer is like, okay, how do we convert them into a client essentially, right? Or a partner, right? So maybe one more like core value or belief that you want to share with the listeners, like that is driving your mission, like of building ICN.
So two come to mind that I would raise. I realize you asked for one, but let me make it two. So first one is I always see more smart people, or not I think this is somebody else said this before, but I truly believe in the fact that there's more smart people always outside that you can ever have inside. It doesn't matter if you're AWS, if you're Google, if you're whatever, right? There's always smarter people, smarter ideas outside than inside. That's number one. And again, this is driving the whole ethos of making this open and allowing everybody to contribute. And then two is the aspect of, how do I phrase this? Like what we need to embrace in Web3 is real world traction and revenue. Yeah, I truly believe in this. Look, I think the ecosystem or just this idea has been around for more than a decade now. And it's showing, I would say, but not always to the degree that you would like. You would like, as in that it becomes embedded in what's already out there. To me, what we all need to do is we need to put the technology in the background and let the advantages of this technology deliver to customer, business, whatever, right? These two elements combined is I think the two core ethos items I would raise. So again, one is smarter people being outside, and then two being demand or let me say product driven, solution oriented, right?
That's also really, really, really good answer. Love it. In the last moment and the last, I would say, question to you, I want to ask you a personal question also, like not related to ICN, because as every smart individual, like you're driven not only by, by the desire of creating something significant, but also something you have your also personal goals in this life, right? So I want to ask you a bonus question. What is the meaning of life to you, Seb?
What is the meaning of life to me?
Yeah.
Small question towards the end. Wow, what's the meaning of life? I think learn and grow. Learn and grow. think what humans were always made of is this desire to explore. And it's this is at the end of the day something that still keeps us going. And me especially. If we embrace being humble and being perceptive to new ideas, generally I think as a society we would be better off.
Yeah, I love it. I think that's also an important mission because I always ask this question, at the end, like, and I want to learn like your personal goals. I think that's
So what
what's
is it for you?
people always ask me. To
Very
me,
one-sided, eh? What's
no,
what's it?
you're one of the few people who actually ask in return. Like, so for me, the final, like I would say the meaning is I would call it complete love and unity and like, this oneness, like, when you actually empirically like you experience it. Not just theoretically learn about it, but when you actually understand that you're part of everything and and everything is part of you, like, and that's like scientists call it singularity, like in romanticized version of it, it can be love, but it's very, unfortunately, the word is very, has a different meaning, let's put it this way. So, yeah, I think the more you give, the more you start becoming equal to the nature. And yeah, that's where I want to become closer to this state.
I like it. I like it. And I think your podcasts at least start building the foundation for that.
Yeah, that's the name, holistic investments. And no,
Exactly.
I really truly appreciate your knowledge and what you're building an impossible cloud network is truly impressive. It's, like what I've learned a lot from you, and I'm sure that the listeners like learned a lot as well. Where they can find you, like, where if they want to like learn more about the project and if they want to maybe contact you, are you more on LinkedIn, Twitter?
So I think there's a few aspects. So of course, our homepage is always a good start, ICN.global,
Hmm.
and one of our social accounts, so be it Discord or Twitter. Myself, I would say the easiest one would probably be LinkedIn, and the good old classical email also doesn't hurt.
Beautiful. I'll share all this contact info. And again, I'm sure there's a lot of partners who want to connect with you. And I truly wish you success. I think what you're building can actually improve the world and make it a better place. And yeah, so really appreciate what you've shared today. And I hope people will do it too. So please like, share, follow, like Impossible Cloud Network and make sure that you start, maybe if you have a business, like start using them. Thank you so much, Seb.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks for having me.